What if the greatest financial disasters in European history were not isolated scandals, but predictable milestones in a repeating six-stage cycle that is unfolding again right now? This is the uncomfortable question behind the fall of Banco Ambrosiano, the implosion of Parmalat, and the long agony of Monte Paschi di Siena. When you look closely, the pattern is not hidden. It is structural, mathematical, and frighteningly familiar. Europe today is not drifting into instability. It is marching step by step into stage 3 of the same financial cycle that has toppled banking giants for more than a century. To understand why this keeps happening, you need to look beyond the scandals and into the architecture of European finance itself. Every major collapse begins long before balance sheets explode or regulators intervene. It begins when institutions convince themselves that growth can be engineered faster than risk can accumulate. Ambrosiano believed it. Parmalat believed it. Monte Paschi, in its centuries of existence, believed it too. The cycle always starts with optimism, cheap credit, and creative accounting framed as innovation. It shifts into expansion, leverage, and the quiet normalization of practices that insiders know are dangerous but justify as temporary. And then comes the turning point, the moment when the numbers stop lining up, when liquidity thins, when the market senses that something feels engineered rather than earned. Europe has lived through this enough times to recognize the symptoms, yet every generation treats its own cycle as unique. That denial is part of the trap. Stage 3 is not the explosion. It is the exposure. It is the moment when hidden debts surface, when off-balance sheet structures unwind, when trust erodes faster than institutions can respond. And the most important truth is this. Once a system reaches stage 3, the next stages do not wait politely. They accelerate. They compress. They hit harder than leaders expect, because the foundations have been cracking for years before the public even notices. As you listen to this breakdown of the six-stage financial cycle and how Europe is repeating it step by step, think about how these patterns show up in your own experience. Have you ever seen a company, a market, or even a country ignore small warning signs until they became impossible to contain? Comment below and share what moment opened your eyes to financial fragility. And while you are here, remember to like this video and check if you're already subscribed, because understanding these cycles is the only way to avoid being caught inside them. And as we move forward, pay close attention to how each stage connects, because the next part deepens the pattern in ways most people never see. The roots of this six-stage financial cycle stretch far deeper than the collapses most people remember. Long before Banco Ambrosiano became the symbol of European financial corruption, long before Parmalat fooled auditors around the world, and long before Monte Paschi tried to reinvent itself through complex derivatives, the foundations of this repeating pattern were already being laid. Every modern crisis sits on top of centuries of financial behavior, shaped by the same incentives, the same pressures, and the same belief that institutions can stretch reality further than the numbers allow. When you examine these collapses through a wider historical lens, the cycle stops looking like a series of unpredictable events and starts looking like an inherited script, a sequence of decisions that powerful institutions keep following because the structure rewards risk long before it punishes failure. In the early phases of every cycle, financial actors convince themselves that they have discovered a safer model of growth. They frame aggressive expansion as modernization, regulatory flexibility as competitiveness, and rising leverage as a sophisticated tool rather than an early warning sign. Europe's financial history is full of moments where the illusion of stability masked growing vulnerabilities. The shift from traditional banking into shadow structures, off-book financing, and cross-border opacity was not an accident. It was a natural outcome of a system in which returns are celebrated immediately, while risks are buried until they are too large to hide. These roots go back to the era when banking families operated through private networks and secret ledgers, where governance depended more on reputation than transparency. That culture of controlled opacity survived even as the institutions became public and the balance sheets grew to continental scale. As the cycle progresses, something subtle happens inside these institutions. They begin to believe the narrative they once used only to persuade outsiders. They begin to internalize the idea that their size makes them resilient, that their influence makes them untouchable, that regulation will always bend before it breaks them. This mindset is not unique to any decade or sector. It is the recurring psychological engine that transforms small structural flaws into systemic failures. You can see the same logic running beneath the early behavior of Ambrosiano, beneath the polished messaging of Parmalat, beneath the centuries-old pride of Monte Paschi. Each believed the cycle could be managed internally, that the public would never see the cracks forming under the surface. And with that belief, Stage 2 begins, to quietly merge into Stage 3, setting the stage for exposure long before anyone imagines the full consequences. The earliest signs of Stage 3 almost never appear as dramatic revelations. They emerge quietly, disguised as manageable discrepancies, temporary mismatches, or routine adjustments that insiders insist are harmless. This is why the financial cycle advances so predictably. Institutions rarely collapse because of a single catastrophic event. They collapse because of a long chain of small decisions that accumulate beneath the surface long before the public sees anything unusual. In Europe, these faint tremors appeared years before the headline scandals took shape. Banco Ambrosiano showed subtle irregularities long before regulators uncovered offshore networks. Parmalat reported numbers that looked impressively stable even as internal financing structures grew increasingly tangled. Monte Paschi recorded transactions that seemed strategically justified but signaled deeper liquidity stress hidden behind polished reports. The most dangerous part of these early signals is how easy they are to ignore. Executives, auditors, and regulators often rationalize the inconsistencies as temporary distortions or industry norms. When growth targets must be met, narratives become more important than numbers. When political pressure intersects with financial performance, oversight becomes selective. And when institutions have a long history or symbolic importance, as with Monte Paschi, the collective instinct is to protect the legacy rather than confront emerging vulnerabilities. These dynamics create a perfect environment for Stage 3 to form, because the system begins rewarding the concealment of risk instead of its correction. Inside these institutions, professionals notice the signs long before they reach the public. Analysts begin to see unusual asset movements. Internal departments notice discrepancies between reported liquidity and operational strain. Auditors identify gaps that do not align with underlying activity. But each individual warning seems too small to justify escalation, and the cycle thrives on this fragmentation of responsibility. Everyone sees a piece of the problem. No one sees the whole structure. And even those who sense the broader pattern often convince themselves that there is still time for the institution to stabilize, restructure, or innovate its way out of exposure. This is where the cycle gains momentum. Once the signs are present but unaddressed, the next phase becomes almost inevitable. Institutions begin layering new strategies on top of old problems, compounding fragility instead of resolving it. They rely on short-term liquidity patches, complex financial instruments, and creative reporting to maintain the illusion of stability. The weaknesses become embedded in the system, and each attempt to strengthen the structure actually increases its sensitivity to shock. By the time the market senses that something is wrong, Stage 3 is not beginning. It is well advanced, and the pressures building inside the institutions are preparing to force the vulnerabilities into the open, exactly as history has shown in every major European collapse. By the time Banco Ambrosiano entered the public spotlight, the internal mechanics of Stage 3 had already been shaping its downfall for years. What appeared to the outside world as a sudden financial scandal was, in reality, the culmination of a gradual erosion of transparency, accountability, and structural integrity. Institutions entering this stage often operate with a veneer of confidence, projecting stability through polished reports and controlled messaging, while internally relying on increasingly fragile networks of off-balance sheet entities and shadow financing channels. Ambrosiano became the textbook example of this shift. Its expansion looked bold, modern, and strategically aligned with the ambitions of Italian finance, yet every step deeper into its offshore structures tightened the rope around its own stability. The most revealing aspect of Ambrosiano's trajectory was how seamlessly the institution moved from mild irregularities to complex financial engineering without triggering immediate alarm. This happens because Stage 3 rewards silence. Executives justify aggressive strategies as necessary for competitiveness. Auditors feel pressured to interpret irregular patterns as acceptable variations. Regulators hesitate to confront institutions that appear systemically important or politically connected. And in the case of Ambrosiano, these pressures created an environment where the cracks eventually widened into structural fractures. Funds circulated through offshore companies that existed more as conceptual placeholders than functioning enterprises, creating the illusion of liquidity while masking deteriorating fundamentals that were already pushing the institution beyond recovery. Ambrosiano was not unique in this progression. It simply revealed how deeply embedded this behavior had become within the European financial ecosystem. Once an institution shifts from managing risk to managing perception, the cycle accelerates. Liquidity that once flowed through clear channels begins to move through opaque corridors designed not to strengthen the institution, but to postpone confrontation with reality. The numbers still appear stable, the growth still looks convincing, and the market still believes the institution is resilient. But behind that presentation, pressure builds. Internal teams struggle to reconcile reported figures with operational constraints. Executives begin to rely on increasingly narrow pathways to maintain short-term solvency. And every decision taken to stabilize the surface weakens the structure beneath it. By the time Ambrosiano collapsed, Stage 3 had already transformed the institution into something fundamentally different from the bank it claimed to be. It no longer operated on transparent financial principles, but on layered justifications designed to protect its image. And once a system reaches that point, exposure is not a matter of if but when, because the structure can no longer sustain the weight of its own contradictions. This moment marked Europe's entry into a modern pattern of institutional unraveling that still echoes through the continent today, reshaping expectations and forcing a confrontation with vulnerabilities that had been ignored for far too long. If you've ever seen early signs of instability in a system long before the public noticed, share your experience in the comments and tell me what made you realize something deeper was unfolding. Parmalat became one of the clearest demonstrations that Europe's financial vulnerabilities were not confined to traditional banks. When the company collapsed, it shocked the public because it operated in an industry most people associated with stability and tangible products. Yet this is precisely why Stage 3 becomes so dangerous. It does not only affect institutions built on complex financial instruments. It affects any organization that discovers it can manipulate perception faster than it can solve underlying operational weaknesses. Parmalat perfected this illusion. The company presented itself as a global food giant with diversified operations, a stable cash flow, and ambitious international expansion. But beneath that polished exterior, a parallel financial universe was taking shape, built on fabricated assets, circular transactions, and a growing dependence on structures designed to hide rather than support its balance sheet. What makes Parmalat particularly important in understanding the cycle is how systematically the deception unfolded. It did not begin with the massive fictitious bank account that later became the symbol of the scandal. It began with small distortions that gradually evolved into a coordinated system of financial engineering. Every time the company faced liquidity pressure, it built another layer of artificial stability. Debt was shifted, revenues were inflated, and losses were redirected into offshore entities disconnected from real performance. These mechanisms did not emerge out of chaos. They emerged out of the belief that the company could postpone correction until growth returned, until markets stabilized, or until expansion created new opportunities to cover old obligations. That belief is the essence of Stage 3. Inside Parmalat, the structure became self-reinforcing. Departments operated with partial knowledge of the wider fragility, and individuals convinced themselves that the irregularities were temporary or strategically necessary. The leadership crafted a narrative that framed every manipulation as an intelligent adaptation to market pressures. Once that narrative became internalized, the boundaries between innovation and deception blurred. The company's identity became tied not to its actual performance, but to its engineered image, pushing it further into a parallel financial reality that could not sustain itself indefinitely. When the truth finally surfaced, the scale of the fabrication stunned global markets, yet the mechanisms of the collapse mirrored earlier patterns. A small circle of decision-makers controlled access to real financial information. External oversight relied heavily on reports crafted to obscure risk. Auditors who should have been alarmed by inconsistencies accepted explanations that aligned with their expectations rather than the emerging evidence. Investors trusted growth trajectories that no longer reflected operational truth. These dynamics created a momentum that carried Parmalat deeper into exposure until the structure could no longer support the weight of its own invention. Parmalat remains a critical reminder that the financial cycle does not discriminate between sectors. It spreads wherever incentives reward appearance over substance, wherever institutions discover that managing perception provides faster returns than managing fundamentals. And once that logic takes hold, the system moves quietly but steadily toward the next stage, reinforcing the pattern that Europe continues to repeat. Once an institution enters stage 3, the progression toward stage 4 is not driven by fate or coincidence. It is driven by mathematics. Every fragile structure carries within it a set of pressures that accumulate predictably, accelerating as time passes and narrowing the options available for recovery. The financial cycle advances because the numbers eventually overpower the narrative. Ambrosiano reached this point when its offshore networks grew faster than its real capital. Parmalat reached it when its fabricated assets exceeded the scale of its legitimate operations. Monte Paschi reached it when its derivative strategies created obligations larger than the institution could absorb. These events were not random. They were the measurable outcome of systems designed to postpone accountability, rather than resolve underlying weaknesses. At the core of this progression is a simple imbalance. Institutions in stage 3 rely on structures that create the appearance of liquidity without generating actual liquidity. They produce balance sheet stability through mechanisms that cannot survive the stress they are built to conceal. Mathematical pressure builds when obligations accumulate at a pace that true earnings cannot match. This gap widens every quarter, every reporting cycle, until the institution becomes dependent on increasingly complex financial maneuvers to cover the shortfall. The model becomes fragile not because it stops functioning, but because it must function perfectly to avoid immediate exposure. Any disruption, even a small one, triggers a cascade that reveals how thin the foundation has become. Another mathematical force driving the shift into stage 4 is compounding distortion. Every time an institution chooses to hide a problem rather than address it, the cost of future correction multiplies. Assets must be revalued, liabilities must be restructured, and liquidity must be replenished at a scale that eventually becomes impossible to achieve. The institution becomes trapped in a system of exponential vulnerability. What begins as a single inconsistency expands into a network of interconnected weaknesses that cannot be isolated or repaired independently. By the time the institution recognizes the magnitude of the problem, the structure has already evolved beyond the point where incremental adjustments can restore stability. These dynamics do not only operate internally, they also shape how the market interprets the institution from the outside. When financial entities begin relying heavily on engineered stability, subtle changes in investor behavior emerge. Confidence becomes more volatile, credit availability becomes more sensitive, and small fluctuations in performance trigger disproportionately large reactions. Stage 3 institutions often appear stable on paper, yet market participants sense the imbalance beneath the numbers. This creates feedback loops where perceived fragility becomes real fragility, accelerating the system's movement into stage 4. Each month of delay increases the mathematical strain, compressing the timeline until exposure becomes unavoidable. This is why stage 4 arrives abruptly, even though its foundations were built slowly. Institutions spend years constructing environments that hide risk, but once the mathematics turn against them, the collapse moves faster than their ability to respond. It is never the first irregularity that defines the transition. It is the moment when the internal logic of the system can no longer support the weight of accumulated contradictions. That is when the cycle advances, not because leaders choose it, but because the numbers leave them no alternative, setting the stage for the instability that Europe continues to face as more institutions approach the same threshold. The most revealing characteristic of institutions entering the late stages of the financial cycle is not the complexity of their structures or the scale of their hidden liabilities. It is the culture of denial that forms at the top, where leaders convince themselves that the warnings they see are either exaggerated, temporary, or strategically irrelevant. This denial is not rooted in ignorance, it is rooted in familiarity. Executives who built their careers navigating financial pressure begin to believe that every challenge can be managed through experience, influence, or internal adjustments. They mistake past survival for future resilience, assuming that the system will bend before it breaks because it always has. This mentality becomes the final reinforcement of Stage 3, pushing the institution closer to exposure while giving leaders the illusion that they remain in control. Inside these organizations, denial becomes a form of operational strategy. Reports highlighting structural weaknesses are reframed as incomplete analyses. Internal warnings are labeled as overreactions. Projections that reveal long-term unsustainability are dismissed as pessimistic or lacking context. The leadership team begins focusing not on the numbers themselves, but on ways to reinterpret them in line with the institution's preferred narrative. This is not a unique flaw of Ambrosiano, Parmalat, or Monte Paschi. It is the recurring psychology of systems under stress. When acknowledging the truth would require radical restructuring, leaders choose interpretations that preserve stability, even if that stability exists only on paper. As this mindset spreads, decision-making narrows. Leaders stop asking how to fix the system and begin asking how long it can be maintained. They prioritize liquidity patches over structural repair, communication strategy over transparency, and political protection over operational reform. Institutions that once relied on disciplined financial principles now rely on reputation, hoping that confidence will hold long enough for conditions to improve. But the cycle does not reward hope. It penalizes delay. And each month of postponement intensifies the mathematical pressures already pushing the structure towards Stage 4. This culture of denial also has a secondary effect. It silences those who see the truth most clearly. Analysts, auditors, and mid-level managers who raise concerns find themselves isolated or redirected. Their warnings are absorbed into a system that treats skepticism as a threat rather than a safeguard. As a result, the final opportunity for internal correction disappears. No one wants to be the person who forces acknowledgement of a problem that leadership is determined to downplay. And once an institution reaches this psychological threshold, the transition into Stage 4 becomes not only inevitable but accelerated, because the last mechanisms capable of preventing exposure have been stripped away. By the time external observers begin to sense instability, the leadership's internal denial has already removed the institution's ability to adapt. What remains is a structure running on momentum rather than strategy, hoping that conditions will shift even as the underlying pressures grow stronger. This is the silent turning point where the cycle shifts from manageable vulnerability to unavoidable exposure, and where history shows that the most important warnings were ignored long before the crisis became visible. If you've witnessed this kind of denial inside an institution or market, share your experience in the comments and describe what made you realize the pattern was repeating. Monte Paschi di Siena embodies a paradox that defines the European financial landscape: the belief that age, tradition, and historical prestige can shield an institution from the pressures that govern modern financial cycles. For centuries, Monte Paschi presented itself not merely as a bank, but as a living institution woven into the fabric of Italy's political, economic, and social history. Its longevity created an aura of resilience, a sense that no matter how turbulent the environment became, the bank's identity and legacy would guarantee stability. Yet this same narrative became the foundation for its vulnerability. By the time the modern era imposed new regulatory frameworks, new competitive pressures, and new demands for transparency, the institution's internal structures were already struggling to adapt. The pride that once sustained it began to mask the weaknesses forming beneath its traditional facade. As the pressures accumulated, Monte Paschi entered the financial cycle through the same mechanisms that defined earlier collapses, but with unique historical weight. The bank relied increasingly on complex financial instruments to maintain the appearance of strength. These instruments, especially the now infamous derivative transactions, were presented as strategic tools designed to stabilize performance during periods of stress. In reality, they functioned as sophisticated methods to delay recognition of losses that had already crystallized. The institution found itself trapped between the desire to preserve an image of historical continuity and the need to confront structural deficiencies that could no longer be postponed. This tension pushed it deeper into the architecture of Stage 3, where perception overrides reality and internal mechanisms become increasingly fragile. What makes Monte Paschi's trajectory particularly revealing is how deeply external forces intertwined with its internal weaknesses. Political influence, regional loyalty, and institutional symbolism complicated every attempt at reform. Stakeholders who viewed the bank as a cultural anchor resisted measures that threatened its identity, even when those measures were necessary for long-term stability. This conflict transformed financial decisions into political dilemmas, slowing the institution's ability to adapt and reinforcing the cycle's momentum. At the same time, competitive pressures from larger, more agile European banks intensified the imbalance. Monte Paschi was caught between its past and its future, unable to rely on tradition, yet unprepared to fully embrace the structural changes required for resilience. As the institution attempted to navigate these competing forces, its strategies grew more reactive. Liquidity was managed through short-term arrangements, transparency was selectively applied, and restructuring efforts focused more on public reassurance than on operational correction. Each step taken to preserve stability created new dependencies, amplifying the mathematical pressures already embedded within the system. By the time the broader financial market sensed that Monte Paschi was struggling, the institution had already crossed the threshold into a version of Stage 3 that mirrored modern collapses, but carried the symbolic weight of centuries. The exposure that followed was not merely the unraveling of a bank, but the unraveling of a narrative that had been treated as unbreakable. Monte Paschi's story demonstrates that no institution, no matter how old or culturally significant, is exempt from the cycle. If anything, legacy institutions face a unique vulnerability: the pressure to appear stable even when the numbers reveal otherwise. And, once that tension becomes unsustainable, the transition toward the next stage unfolds with the same inevitability that has marked every major collapse in Europe's financial history. Across Europe, the signals that once appeared only inside institutions like Ambrosiano, Parmalat, and Monte Paschi have now begun to surface at the structural level of the continent itself. The financial pressures that once unfolded within individual balance sheets are now visible across national economies, banking, unions, and regulatory frameworks. What makes this stage particularly revealing is that Europe is not facing a new type of instability. It is revisiting the exact same dynamics that have defined every major institutional collapse in its financial history. The symptoms are no longer isolated. They are synchronized. Debt levels continue to rise faster than productivity. Liquidity buffers are increasingly reliant on temporary interventions, and markets react with growing volatility to even modest deviations in policy or performance. These conditions mirror the mathematics of Stage 3, now scaled to an entire region. One of the clearest indicators is the widening gap between reported stability and underlying fragility. Public institutions across Europe present coordinated messaging that emphasizes resilience, unity, and the strength of regulatory oversight. Yet beneath those assurances lie the same distortions that once triggered institutional exposure. Banks seek short-term liquidity through mechanisms that resemble the engineered solutions of earlier crises. Governments rely on financial tools designed to smooth over structural weaknesses rather than resolve them. And cross-border interdependence, once seen as a stabilizing force, now amplifies the risks because vulnerabilities in one nation propagate quickly through the financial system of the entire bloc. Another sign of the advancing cycle is the increasing tension between political goals and economic realities. Policy. Decisions across Europe frequently prioritize short-term stability over long-term sustainability, echoing the mindset that once drove institutions deeper into Stage 3. Fiscal rules are adjusted to accommodate rising obligations. Monetary interventions grow more frequent, and the distance between regulatory expectations and market behavior continues to expand. These pressures force institutions and governments to rely on tools that function only as long as confidence remains intact. But confidence is precisely what weakens most rapidly in this stage of the cycle. As investors detect inconsistencies between official narratives and market signals, reactions become sharper, and liquidity becomes more sensitive to minor shifts in sentiment. The final and most telling indicator is the growing normalization of structural risk. Just as Ambrosiano normalized offshore networks, just as Parmalat normalized financial engineering, and just as Monte Paschi normalized derivative dependencies, Europe is normalizing conditions that would once have been considered exceptional. High public debt, compressed banking margins, reliance on temporary liquidity support, and political fragmentation have become accepted features of the system. This normalization masks the progression of the cycle by framing deterioration as adaptation. Institutions, policymakers, and markets treat repeated warnings as part of the landscape rather than evidence of a deeper pattern. When viewed together, these signals reveal that Europe is not struggling with isolated economic challenges. It is following the same trajectory that led earlier institutions into Stage 4, the moment when exposure accelerates and the structure can no longer hide the accumulated contradictions. The same psychological patterns, the same mathematical pressures, and the same strategic miscalculations are shaping the continent's financial reality. And just as history shows, the next stage does not negotiate. It arrives when the system has exhausted its ability to postpone the truth, preparing the ground for the shift that Europe is now approaching more rapidly than most observers are willing to admit. As Europe moves deeper into the late phase of Stage 3, the transition into Stage 4 becomes less a question of prediction and more a matter of recognizing the forces already shaping its trajectory. The same pressures that once pushed Ambrosiano toward exposure, the same structural contradictions that dragged Parmalat into collapse, and the same historical weight that pulled Monte Paschi into crisis are now operating across entire national systems. Stage 4 does not announce itself with a single event. It begins when the internal logic of the system can no longer maintain the illusion of stability, and every mechanism built to delay recognition becomes a source of acceleration. Liquidity dries faster, policy responses lose their impact, and financial structures that once seemed flexible begin to reveal how rigid they truly are under stress. In this stage, institutions face a narrowing corridor of choices. Adjustments that once bought months now buy only weeks. Market confidence becomes increasingly sensitive to small indicators, and the system's ability to absorb shocks diminishes with each attempt to mask underlying weaknesses. Europe, much like the institutions that preceded it, now carries vulnerabilities that compound each other. Elevated debt, fragmented governance, dependence on external liquidity, and a growing disconnect between official messaging and financial reality. These factors don't simply coexist. They reinforce one another, amplifying instability in a way that transforms isolated risks into systemic pressure points. As this dynamic deepens, Stage 4 unfolds through rapid shifts in confidence, sudden adjustments in valuations, and liquidity strains that spread faster than policymakers can intervene. What makes this transition particularly significant is not just the financial impact, but the psychological shift that accompanies it. In Stage 3, denial preserves the system. In Stage 4, denial accelerates exposure. Leaders attempt to reassure the public, but each reassurance carries diminishing weight. Markets react not only to numbers but to tone, timing, and subtle changes in narrative. Institutions that once relied on reputation find that reputation can no longer compensate for mathematical reality. This is the moment when the cycle stops operating in the background and begins shaping public behavior, investment decisions, and political outcomes. And once that shift occurs, the system enters a phase where events move faster than discussions about them, a pattern Europe has experienced before and is approaching again. As we continue exploring how this cycle expands, reshapes institutions, and influences entire regions, take a moment to reflect on how these patterns appear in your own view of financial stability. If you reached this point with me, leave a comment saying this message was for me so I know you're following the full sequence. And if this analysis helped you understand how these stages unfold, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss the next breakdown. A like also helps this conversation reach more people who are trying to make sense of what's happening beneath the surface. And if you want to go even deeper, there's another video right here on the side that continues this exploration from a different angle. Click and keep going with me there, because the next steps of the cycle reveal even more than what we uncovered here.